So let us begin then. Thank you all for being present today. It's the first seminar of the seminar series we organize in the History of Philosophy and Biology Teaching Lab, which is located here at the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. And we have the great pleasure to begin a series with Professor Dr. Kostas Kampourakis, who works at the University of Geneva at the section of Biology and University Teacher Training Institute. Kostas has been working, is particularly interested in the public understanding of evolution genetics, as well as of the nature of science. And he's the author of many books and scientific articles. Some of his books are bestsellers, I would say, like Understanding Evolution or Understanding Genes. And he's the editor of the book series Understanding Life, published by Cambridge University Press. He's also co-editor of the Springer book series, Contributions from Biology of Education Research. Has been the editor-in-chief of the Springer Journal Science and Education. It's the major journal in the field of history, philosophy, and science teaching. I had the deep pleasure of working with Kostas when he was the editor, as the book review editor. And he founded the Springer book series, Science, Philosophy, History, and Education. So Kostas, thank you very much for being the first in our seminar series. And Kostas will talk to us about students' teleological misconceptions in evolution education, why the underlying design stance, not teleology per se, is the problem. So I will pass now to Kostas. Thank you very much again, and thank you all for the audience.
Thank you very much, Sir Bell, for the very nice words. I'm delighted to be here and to see you all. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just to clarify that I'm not strictly speaking a philosopher of science, although some people think of me that way. I primarily work in science education, but I'm very interested in philosophical issues. And I think that whatever we do in science education makes more sense in the light of history and philosophy of science, to paraphrase Dobzhansky. So today's talk is based on a paper that was published a couple of years ago in the journal Education, Evolution, and Outreach. And you will see the reference throughout. Sabel has it, or if you want it, you can easily find it. The journal is open access. And the topic of today's talk and of that paper is whether teleology is a problem in understanding evolution. And I'm going to argue that teleology per se is not the problem. What is the problem is the underlying design stance that characterizes students' explanations. So to make things simple, we can begin with a question that will guide us throughout the talk. For instance, we can ask, why do we have a heart? And to this question, the most intuitive answer is in order to pump blood. Perhaps you all know how this organ works. It's a muscle that continuously pumps blood to the lungs and to the rest of the body, so that the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place effectively. Now, the big question is the explanation we have a heart in order to pump blood a legitimate one for the presence of a heart? Is reference to the function of the heart a sufficient explanation for its presence? Overall, we have why questions in biology, and we have at least three different kinds of causes. We can have ultimate causes, which are backward looking and have to do with evolution. We have proximate causes, which are also backward looking and have to do with development. And we have final causes, which are forward-looking and relate to a goal. So if we ask the question, why do we have a heart? We can give different kinds of causal explanations. We can say that we have a heart because there was selection for this organ that thus became prevalent in the ancestor of mammals, and of course, thereafter diversified. We can say that we have a heart because the cells in that area of the body of the individual were differentiated to become heart muscle. And we can give the explanation that comes into your mind in order to pump blood. The first explanation refers to populations and evolution. The second explanation refers to individuals and development. And the last one refers to function. So we have two explanations that look back to the past and begin with because, an evolutionary and a developmental one, and one forward-looking explanation in order to, which is a teleological explanation. These features are summarized here. This is a table from the paper, and you can see everything here. What is important, perhaps, is that the last kind of explanation, the teleological explanation, can apply either to populations or to individuals and has to do with function. So let us consider a bit what teleological explanations are about. If you look at dictionaries, it will be defined as the belief that everything has a special purpose or use with respect to philosophy, or as you see here, the explanation that phenomena in terms of purpose are that serve, excuse me, I cannot see here, the explanation of phenomena in terms of purpose they serve. And just for the record, etymologically, it should be teleology because the Greek word is telos, but it somehow became accepted like this. So we can say overall that teleological explanation is a mode of explanation in which a phenomenon is explained in terms of a final end, that's the telos, to which it contributes. And we usually find expressions such as in order to, for the sake of, so that. We can generally find two kinds of explanations in the history of philosophy, going back to ancient Greece. We have Platonic teleological explanations, which are unnatural. This means that whatever is explained in teleological terms exists because it was intentionally created for a purpose by Plato's demiurge or demiurgos, and not by natural processes. And then we have his student Aristotle, who developed natural teleological explanations. And in this case, whatever is explained in teleological terms exists because it has positive consequences for its possessor without any intentionality or design. In this case, something exists for what it does, and it doesn't exist due to some external agent. So there's an important distinction here to keep in mind. We have teleological explanations that can be based on design. Something exists because of its consequences that contribute to the fulfillment of an external agent's intention to achieve a goal. And in this case, intentional design is assumed. But we can also have teleological explanations based on natural processes, something that exists because of its consequences that contribute to the well-being of its possessor. And here there is no assumption of intentional design. Now, my point is, I'm not saying that Plato and Aristotle said exactly that, but all I'm saying is that we find the differences between the two. We can arrive at these two kinds of teleological explanations today. So to give an example, if we wonder why these beetles here that have a brown color are successfully concealed in their environment, which is also brown, and ask ourselves how did they arrive there from an initial population of green and brown beetles. If you ask students, the intuitive explanation is that they needed to adapt, there was a purpose, there was a plan for them to adapt in order to survive. And they usually explain that by saying that individual beetles change their colors, change their genes or whatever, to change their color from green to brown. This is what design teleology is about. Something changes intentionally, purposefully for a goal. However, we have another kind of teleology that usually goes unnoticed. This is an explanation based on natural selection. And as you all know, this is the case where we have an initial population with variation, but because, for instance, predators can spot the green ones, the green beetles on the ground more easily than the brown ones, eventually it is only or mostly the brown ones that survive. This is an explanation based on natural selection, And this is a kind of teleology as well, which can be described as selection teleology. Now, the question is, why is this teleological? And this is not something that is my idea. This was first suggested by Jim Lennox many years ago in a paper in Biology and Philosophy, provocatively but accurately titled "Darwin Was a Teleologist," where he explained that whenever we have a trait such as brown color present in a population, such as the one of beetles we're talking about, and if this brown color has an effect, a particular effect, in this case, concealment, and if this effect is advantageous, for instance, for avoiding predators to its peers, then we can say that the brown color will be selectively favored, and therefore it is the effect, the concealment, that is the cause of the traits of the brown color's presence in the population. In short, something exists because of what it does and therefore exists for doing it. Given this, we can arrive at some conclusions. Explanations based on natural selection are teleological in the sense that something is explained, the presence of something is explained based on what it does. Explanations based on natural selection are causes, because causes relate to past events, for instance, the antecedent conditions that drove the population to evolve. And teleological explanations based on design are also causal, because in this case, causes relate to intentions and intentional design. Therefore, the distinction that we usually find, especially in science education, between causal explanation and teleological explanation can be misleading, because teleological explanations are also causal. Also, considering teleology as bad, as the adjective or the noun that characterizes students' misconception, is also misleading. And actually, this is what has mostly happened in the literature. And I'm going to argue that the problem with students' conceptions is not teleology, but the design that underlies it. So, to summarize here, we have three types of teleology: external, internal in the case of design teleology, and selection teleology. The consequence etiology is different in these cases, and the most important feature is that design teleology assumes design or purpose, whereas this is not the case for selection teleology. Let us now turn to what students do and what students think. There is a lot of research that shows that students usually believe, I'm talking mostly about school students, that students usually believe that organisms, individuals can adapt. As you can see here, read a book about how to avoid natural selection, dare to be nocturnal, do it by instinct, and things like that. They believe that organisms can adapt to whatever condition, especially if there's sufficient time. And if we look at what exactly they think, they even sometimes arrive at the conclusion that if an organism absolutely needs something, a feature, in order to survive, it's going to get it, especially if there is sufficient time. Will find a way, as the actor in Jurassic Park described it. And of course, this is further enhanced by documentary films that show how well adapted organisms are in their environments, like this animal here. And actually, the inference made usually is that this animal has concealed itself in its environment in the same way that this soldier here has intentionally concealed himself with the clothes he wears in order not to be visible by the enemy. This is further enhanced by metaphors like these two in these otherwise very interesting books, The Tinkerer's Accomplice and the Blind Watchmaker. The watchmaker and the tinkerer, as you probably know, is natural selection, but this anthropomorphism further enhances perhaps students' intuitions about design and purpose in nature. And of course, there are linear representations of evolution that shows that it happens towards a final end. Usually, in our case, it's our species, humans, for other more primitive forms. Now, given this, there is also interesting research that has shown that, however, if we go deeper into studying, analyzing students' teleological explanations, when they explain their preference for those, they often focus not on purpose and goals, but on functions, which they found familiar or relevant. In other words, this means that if they give teleological explanations, it's not necessary that they're interested in design and purpose, but perhaps they're interested in the functions they perceive the various parts of the body to perform. And this brings us to another issue with metaphors, when we tend to describe organisms as machines and make the correspondence between organisms and machines, forgetting that machines are artifacts intentionally designed for a purpose, which is not the case for organisms. And several papers like these ones you see here have argued that this is problematic for science education. So the question is, if students do believe that there is design in nature and purpose in nature, what exactly do they see? There is a lot of research in psychology that shows that teleological explanations about design, but also about functions, are very intuitive, and they are there from very early on. This is something that is probably acquired, not somehow hardwired. And the possible explanation is that we begin our lives surrounded by artifacts. And so perhaps we become very early on very sensitive and very well familiar with the action of agents and the purposeful use of objects. If you think of what you did, because you probably cannot remember, I cannot either, but if you think of yourselves, or if you have children and you think of your children, what they were surrounded with in their very early days, it's usually artifacts, chairs, tables, toys, or whatever, and perhaps a few animals, but that is all if you have a pet. Most of the objects we encounter in our lives fairly early on are artifacts, so there is a chance that we become sensitive to the intentional creation and use of objects, which we might then extrapolate to nature. There is also a lot of research that has tried to figure out how young children and adults perceive different kinds of objects in nature. And one body of research, mostly led by Frank Kyle, has shown that children especially provide teleological explanations for organisms and artifacts, but not for natural objects such as clouds or rocks. In this case, there are correspondences to be found. For instance, organisms like this flower here can have thorns, which are self-serving because they protect itself, whereas artifacts such as this barbed wire have thorns to protect something that is useful to us humans. In other words, is other-serving. Or perhaps they say that organism plants are green in order to survive, whereas for natural objects, they say that they consist of green parts, even though, as you probably know, this explanation is very accurate for the plant as well. So the point is that students and children, and sometimes adults, find correspondences between organisms and artifacts, but not correspondences between organisms and natural objects. Another body of research led by Deborah Kellerman has suggested that actually children and adults, especially children, provide teleological explanations for everything, all kinds of objects. So they say that we have babies for loving, we have clocks for telling the hour, but this is also the case for natural objects. Mountains are there for climbing and clouds are there for raining. So the question becomes, what is accurate then? Several years ago, we tried to test this with a study. So we worked with kindergarten and first and second year old children and tried to see what they think of this. So we showed them familiar and unfamiliar objects. On the left, you see the familiar ones, and on the right, you see the unfamiliar ones. and we asked them why they have these particular features. We wanted to see how they would explain the existence and the features of these objects. So what we found is that overall, teleological explanations dropped with age. Attention, this was not a longitudinal study. These were cross-sectional studies in different grades. So what I said is not entirely accurate, but in any case, older students, we found that they gave less teleological explanations than younger students. However, when we analyzed this to the constituent parts, we found what actually changes is that the teleological explanations for natural objects drop. So whereas kindergarten children gave many explanations for natural objects, the older students gave less. In contrast, organisms and artifacts did not change that much. So actually what we thought we might see here, but this requires further research, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody has done this ever since, is that perhaps we begin with a teleology that is focused on everything in the beginning, as Kellerman suggested. So initially, everything is explained with purpose and design. And as students grow older, they might restrict this to organisms and artifacts. Furthermore, there's a lot of psychological research in general that shows that people believe that in destiny, in fate, and that things happen for a reason, which not surprisingly correlates with findings of the kind I just presented to you. So this brings to what I consider a very, very important distinction that in my view should be clearly made in schools at the youngest age possible. The differences between organisms and artifacts. If I ask, why do birds have wings? And we show students this picture, they will tell us in order to fly. But if we show them this picture with the penguins, they will give a different answer. They will say that they do this in order to swim because they don't fly. And in this picture, they will be puzzled and look one another and they will not be sure what to say. If we ask the question, why do eagles fly? Why do penguins swim? Here, there's not much to ask. We might arrive at more precise explanations, but the issue is not resolved. Of course, the explanation in those two cases would be that they can fly because they have wings, but does this mean that we cannot say that they have these wings in order to do something? The issue here is that whereas we can explain the presence of the particular features through evolution, that eagles and penguins have wings because they have evolved from a common ancestor with wings, and it doesn't make a difference. It's not that important for what purpose they use this now. This leaves unanswered the existence of this one for students who keep thinking that why the feature is still there. And of course, the problem here is that the feature can be explained, the presence of the feature can be explained by evolution, but we cannot say in general that birds have wings in order to fly. This is something that really troubles and puzzles students. So we can use evolutionary theory to explain how wings have evolved, but I think we can do something else. If we ask students, why do airplanes have wings? The answer will be in order to fly. And no matter what kind of airplane you show, the answer will be always the same. Why? Because airplanes are artifacts intentionally designed for a purpose, to fly. So I think that a key issue here is to make this contrast between organisms and artifacts and explain the differences to students. In my view, there are at least two crucial differences between organisms and artifacts. The first one is that organisms are not intentionally designed for a purpose, artifacts are. And the second is that organisms do not have fixed essences, artifacts do. Interestingly, research by Kyle and Kellerman and the others, and Susan Gelman and others, has shown that Actually, people often think exactly in the opposite way. So I think that a key issue here is that we can show students that there are two kinds of inferences. We can say that a structure exists in order to perform a function wherever there is a function, and this is legitimate. And the problem and the key issue we have to address is how did we get there? Whether the function is an evolved one, as in the case of organisms, or whether the function is a designed one, as in the case of artifacts. So with this, I would like to say that the problem is not whether students say that something exists for a purpose, but how they understand that this has come to exist. And the key issue again here is that when we use selection teleology, which only apply to organisms, we can say that eagles have wings in order to fly, but we need to keep in mind how they have come to have that. And the issue here is that airplanes are artifacts and they have the features they have because we designed them that way, but this is not the case for organisms. So if the design stance is the problem, how can we address this? I think that the fundamental change should be done and could be done in how we present nature and objects and entities to students, to children from a very young age. Usually, the distinction made is between living and non-living. And the category of non-living comprises natural objects, non-living natural objects and artifacts, whereas the category of living comprises organisms. So I think we should change that, but I don't have any empirical evidence to say if this would work or not. I think that we should begin by showing students the distinction between designed and not designed objects. In other words, between artifacts and natural objects. And once we had made this clear with all the differences that I just described, we could then go and make the living, non-living distinction among the non-designed objects, among the natural objects. I think this might be a way that would help us address the design stance, which seems to be very intuitive. What else we can do is to show students that organisms are neither intelligent design nor perfectly adapted. And in contrast to documentary films that insist on perfect adaptation, we can show that there are different kinds of adaptations and different kinds of features that might support survival, or there are also cases that features do not support survival. And for whatever other reason, some organisms are still there or die out. All in all, we have to show that organisms are not perfectly adapted in their environments. And my favorite example when I was a teacher, in order to create what can be described as a conceptual conflict situation, is to show them a documentary where these two gray whales, mama and a baby, were traveling until these two guys appeared. And what they did is that they tried carefully to separate the mother from the baby and then push the baby down until it was drowned and they killed it. So when I showed this image to students, I asked them, why do these animals have a hydrodynamic shape? They told me in order to swim fast underwater. Why do these guys have the same shape? For the same reason. And once they saw the documentary, I asked them, why do all these animals have lungs and not gills? Why don't they have gills like fish in order to be able to breathe underwater? And it was there that they showed that the in order to explanation doesn't always work. And this is where I told them that we always need to consider evolution to explain things. Of course, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't say that they have hydrodynamic shape in order to swim underwater, because that's correct. What is incorrect is to apply this everywhere without consideration and not to consider evolutionary history and how we have ended up in this situation. So this can be somehow formalized if we compare, for instance, sharks and dolphins. So we can say in general that organisms have a trait in order to perform a function. And in this case of teleology, we can specify a design teleological formulation. Organisms have a trait in order to perform function because organisms have the features that are necessary for the survival, or a selection teleology explanation that says that organisms have a trait in order to perform a function because the latter confers an advantage, and consequently this trait has been selected for doing this and has been maintained in their lineage. Separating these two, and of course I'm not suggesting that we should show this formulation to students, but this is a principle for us in order to somehow clarify the differences. We could say so that why do dolphins have hydrodynamic shapes? The design teleological explanation would be that this is necessary for survival. The selection teleology explanation would be that this is something that has conferred an advantage and has been selected. If we ask the same for sharks, we would have the same explanations. And we would see that for this one, both of these work, but of course, it is the second one, the selection teleology, that is legitimate. However, if we ask, why don't dolphins have gills? The design teleological explanation would be strange. It would be strange to say that organisms have the features that are necessary for the survival, but still have lungs in order to get more oxygen directly from the atmosphere. The selection explanation would work. And the issue here is that if we ask the same question for sharks, we would have to give a different explanation for gills in terms of design teleology, but still the same selection explanation for the same feature. So all in all, if you look at all these together, you will see that selection teleology works for everything, whereas design teleology does not. And this is how we can bring students to a conceptual conflict situation. This is the same thing that with the previous example, but this is just formalized differently here. So to conclude with the initial question I asked in the beginning, is the explanation we have a heart in order to pump blood a legitimate one for the presence of a heart? I argue that yes, it is, but only insofar as there is explicit reference to evolutionary causes and processes, the fact that organisms are not designed. And of course, we have to keep in mind the possible alternative outcomes of evolution, that things are the way they are, not because they have been designed, but because they took a particular path that led us here where we are today. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.